Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Raphael Shakhter. I am an anthropologist and a curator based at University College London, and I'm the author of the recent
Mika, help
Monumental Graffiti
me.
with MIT Press. I'm super proud, in fact, quite overwhelmed to be hosting today's program, Graffiti from the Streets to Museums, as part of the exhibition OSGEMEOS Endless Story, the first US museum survey and largest US exhibition of work by identical twin brothers Gustavo and Otavio Pandolfo, known globally as OSGEMEOS. Our three panelists today are some of the most important individuals within the history of American graffiti, and also three individuals who have a rich history of interconnections with OSGEMEOS. First, we have Martha Cooper, the legendary photographer, without whom many people, including myself, have argued graffiti as a canonical art genre simply would not exist today. The author of what's called the Bible of Graffiti, Subway Art, as well as a whole library of other books, including RIP Memorial Wall Art, Hip Hop Files 1980 to 84, We Be Girls, Street Play, New York State of Mind, Tagtown, Going Postal, Tokyo Tattoos 1970, One Week with One Up, and Spray Nation. Martha has been shooting graffiti for over 35 years and is as active today, seemingly, as she ever was. It's a real honor to have her here today. Second, we have Days, an artist critical to the topic of today's program theme, having not only been a key member of the original New York graffiti subculture in the 1970s, in fact, featured in Martha Cooper's legendary Subway Art, but also being part of the earliest and most seminal movements of graffiti into the gallery and museum system. Taking part in the groundbreaking Beyond Words exhibition at the Mud Club in 1981, latterly going on to work both at the influential Fashion Moda as well as the legendary Sydney Janis Gallery. Days has since been included in scores of group shows and museum surveys internationally. His work today is included in the permanent collections of the Whitney Museum, the Museum of Modern Art, the Museum of the City of New York, as well as in a multitude of other influential public and private collections. Lastly, but of course not least, we have Caleb Nealon, also known as Sonic, a Massachusetts-based artist and writer who was a key member of the mid-1990s international graffiti scene. Producing work that crossed boundaries between graffiti, muralism, and what would latterly be referred to as street art, Caleb's practice was hugely influenced by his journeys painting all over the world, from Kathmandu to Sao Paulo and back. Not only writing graffiti, however, Caleb has been writing about graffiti since he was in his teens, documenting the art, artists, and history of his global community, and in fact, penning the first in depth article on Oshemios for an international audience back in 1997. Today, Caleb continues to art and written work, and he's authored or collaborated on more than 2 dozen books, including Graffiti Brazil from 2005 and the history of American graffiti in 2011. Okay, so the title of today's talk is Graffiti from the Streets to Museums, during which we will be exploring both the rise of graffiti as an art form and its development from a public to an institutional practice. This conversation is the first in a series of programs for the OSGEMEOS Endless Story exhibition that examines how graffiti imagery has permeated our culture and evolved over time. I'm going to be asking a series of questions to our three guests, and we'll also have some time towards the end for questions from the audience. So do please send in questions into the chat, and we'll ensure to include some of these before we finish at 1. So, Martha, Days, we have you. Caleb, if you could turn on your camera as well, please. Where's Caleb? Is he here? Hopefully he's here. So first then, and through these topics sequentially, so starting with the rise of graffiti as an art form. I wondered if we could first talk about the impact that photography has had on this journey. So, Days, if I may, I'd love to know the way writers understood photography back in the 70s when you were first writing. Obviously, we're talking about a pre-digital age, so the days when film and cameras were expensive objects for young people to have. So, first, did you and your fellow writers take pictures yourself? And second, what were your thoughts when photographers such as Martha and Henry Chalfant first came onto the scene?
Well, I quickly learned in the mid 1970s that documentation of the work was really important because, it was just something, that was just existing for a period of time and then it would disappear in one way or another. So documentation was really important. And, we're kind of referring to the analog days of film. So, I'd have like a 110 camera, a 6 camera, and I would spend countless hours on subway platforms waiting for not just my own pieces to come by, but other writers as well. And I sort of learned just on my own how to kind of set up a shot. My first photos were in the station with very little available light. That really wasn't good. So I had to locate a station on an elevated platform and kind of time when a train would go by, it would go downtown and then it would have a certain amount of time to come uptown on the opposite side of the platform, which would enable me to take a good shot. So it was doing that not myself, but Kel 139 uh, and Knack 143, Crash and myself. We met Henry Chalfant taking photos in the Bronx, and we kind of really didn't know what to make of him. I think we collectively thought he might be a police officer of some sort, but he invited us to his studio, in Soho, and he had portfolios of photographs that he had already shot. He had already been taking photos, I think, for like a couple of years before we met him. So it was amazing, and he had photographs, good quality photographs of some of our work. So seeing that was really amazing. And then through that friendship, eventually we met Martha as well, who I've known for so many years. And I think they both had their own approach to very much their own approach to photography. I think Martha, I mean, obviously you can talk for yourself, but she was really interested in getting the context that the trains appeared in. And Henry's photos were more about documenting the pieces. But photography really opened up the rest of the world to what we were doing through subway art and spray can art. Um, it enabled us to have a much broader audience internationally around the world. So for that, big up Martha. That was really great. And I
You still
think,
have the original pictures.
yes, I still have my own photos. I still kind of take my own photos, just as a documentary type thing. But yeah, photography has always been a really important part of the culture.
Thanks, Days. Moving on to Martha, actually, and that point you made about the kind of contextual aspect of her work, I'm going to come back to later because I think it is really fascinating. But Martha, I'm sure you've been told 1,000 times what a profound impact your work has had on the rise of graffiti as an art form. But I'm fascinated to two things at first. So first, what drew you to documenting graffiti at the kind of early stages? And then also at what point you realized how historically and artistically significant that documentation might be?
Originally, I had studied art and anthropology, and I had thought that I might want to work in an anthropology museum. So when I first moved to New York and I first saw the art on the trains, I mean, this perfectly fit with my own personal interests. Um, what drew the idea that, well, I had been documenting kids playing, and one of those boys introduced me to who was, in fact, he said he knew a king, and he introduced me to Dondi. And Dondi turned out to be an incredibly articulate spokesperson for graffiti. And really, I was intrigued by what he told me because that was the first time I realized that kids were not just scribbling randomly on trains, but that they had a whole vocabulary for their art and that they were in fact, designing their pieces in their black books before they put them on trains and deciding on what colors and then appropriating the correct colors, getting the paint, and and it just fascinated me. So that's what drew me. And then after Dondi took me to the yards and I photographed a few whole cars top to bottom where the paint covered the windows, I was completely hooked because I felt that people weren't documenting this and that it was significant.
Mm. That's amazing. I love that you came from an anthropological background and also how there's kind of a documentary aspect of it, which is kind of maybe the ethnographic aspect of it, but then there's the art historical aspect of it when it kind of is just blooming into this whole larger space.
Yeah, I mean, I felt that the kids had invented an art form that was not understood by adults,
Mm.
but that they could talk about their pieces for maybe not for, well for hours. They could what was good about it, what was bad about it, should it drip, should it not drip, the colors. I heard all kinds of stories about kids going out into New Jersey to source a rare color of paint because at the time there weren't that many colors of spray paint available. And all of that I thought was fascinating.
Thanks, Martha. Caleb, moving a little bit forward to the 1990s and thinking about the circulation of images through the magazines that you were writing for at the time, alongside, I'm sure, the usage of the postal network from sending images directly to and from writers worldwide. I wonder how important photography was to you then as well, and if it was something you saw that was about the distribution of images to fellow artists, about documentation or archiving for posterity, or if it was about the development of the art in itself.
Well, my generation was one of the several that came up with that subway art as the reference, with looking at, Martha's photos of artists like Days, and that was that was the gospel that we were emulating. Um, and I thought of it a while ago as it was an example of hyperbole, and I'll say it, and it sounds hyperbolic, but go ahead and think of something that proves me wrong. I'm all ears. Subway art was the single most consequential art book of the 20th century. Full stop.
Agreed.
Okay, I'm going to
Amazing.
just put a full period on that. It sounds
Amazing.
crazy and hyperbolic, but think of something that could prove me wrong and give me a specific. Um, like I say, I'm all ears, but it just as a ridiculous conversation starter, that's where I'm at. We have this,
Thank
we're
you.
all here because of that. There is no this without that book. And so starting that up, after a while though, there was kind of a gentleman's agreement among the New York publishers and the other publishers to not touch graffiti as any sort of more books. So after Subway Art came out, then you had Spray Can Art, which had a teeny weeny taste of art that had been done sort of emulating the New Yorkers from all around the world are, what are, I think 128 page books. So they're such a nice little taste, but they don't give you everything you want. And after that,
96 pages.
okay,
Yeah.
truthfully withdrawn. That, I mean, this was not enough. And so the nice thing was in the 90s, there was the sort of desktop publishing revolution, so to speak. And for a nice little window of time before the internet came in and subsumed everything, or the web came in and subsumed all this distribution of images, there were a lot of people who were, college who had access to a scanner at a college lab, because at that point these things were like $4,000. Um, who were making magazines. And you could sell them at another, relic of that era of Tower Books and Tower Music or something like that. And you could sell pretty decent units of magazines. You could sell 20, 25,000 copies of a graffiti magazine. And for that period in the 90s, that was how things kept current. Um, and so it was how stuff got around. And it was how these images were shared at that point. And the cool thing about that at that point, as these were all being done by writers themselves also. And so there was a sense where, um, where there was kind of an ownership and a responsibility being passed over from very cool adults who were not participants necessarily in the art form, like Martha or Henry or people, to the people who were doing it themselves. Um, and I loved it, getting involved in that, because it was a way for me to, um, be nosy and ask questions of people who were way above where I was ability wise. That was the greatest. And it led me right to Brazil.
25,000 copies is an incredible amount to think about.
It
But
is.
so it was very much like about writers for writers. You were thinking about distributing for your kind of like your fellow community. It wasn't thinking about as much about kind of the posterity or the archiving of this as such, or was it both?
I think every writer, sort of after you got part of the message that was great and implicit in Subway Art, was you better photograph your stuff because it's going away. So that was the piece of it that was going away. And it gave you multiple, if you were photographically inclined, it gave you two styles of photography to kind of choose from. Do you want to get your copy stand kind of version like the Henry shots, or do you want to get your environmental shots like Martha's? And of course, everybody who was trying to do it right was trying to get one of each because that's better. And um and so it was there. The documentation was always so key because everything goes away. It's gone.
Mhm. That's great. Thanks, Caleb. I mean, that kind of leads on to coming back to Martha, because secondly, I want to kind of move to thinking about graffiti's development, like from a public to an institutional practice. And so with Martha, both, I wonder what your kind of relationship was to the wider art institutions during both that kind of earlier and also the later stages of graffiti's institutional development. In that, obviously, Subway Art was so huge in kind of projecting this kind of new in understanding of graffiti. But also, I wonder when your work with graffiti itself was understood as art rather than just documentation. Because I think there's something that's like so clearly seen through that kind of environmental and contextual aspect of your work, in which graffiti is always placed within the wider setting which it kind of exists. That pushes it to itself being kind of an art form rather than only documentation. So yeah, so two questions I've tried to squeeze in there. Both how what your kind of relationship was like with that world, and kind of the tensions there may have been, or kind of the responsibilities there were in terms of kind of your role in this development of graffiti into a kind of a larger than public practice, and also kind of the idea of your work itself as it's their artworks, not simply documentation.
Well, starting with the second question, I do not want to call myself an artist. And for example, if somebody sends me a contract, I make them say photographer, not artist. I consider myself a documentary photographer and more on the journalism side. And when I started documenting graffiti, I was a staff photographer at the New York Post, of all, not the Times, the Post. Um, which is kind of a down and dirty newspaper for anybody that doesn't know, and a rough and ready sort of newspaper. And that's more how I see myself, as this kind of rough and ready photographer. I'm not really trying to make art out of somebody else's art, but I'm trying to show that art in the context, in maybe not in the context that most people saw it, because as we're talking, most people did not see the actual pieces. Unlike today, when graffiti writers are streaming as they're painting in the yards, back then, the only way to see it was in a photograph. And they weren't running up to the Bronx to see it go by whatever abandoned building I was trying to shoot as the background. And if you look at Subway Art, I tried to shoot every time I got a nice picture of a nice train with a nice background. I drove around the Bronx looking for a different background. I didn't like to shoot the same background over and over and over again. So, I mean, most people didn't get to see the trains that way. They saw them in the station as they were getting onto them quickly. So, okay, that's number one. I don't see myself as an artist. And I don't really see the photographs as art, although I do sell fine art prints. And the first part of that question, what was the first part?
But I wonder, like, what your kind of relationship were to the
Oh,
wider
with
art
institutions, I don't have much of a relationship with any institution. The only institution that has really been receptive is the Museum of the City of New York. And I think we all know Sean Corcoran, the curator there. Martin Wong's collection is in the museum. There's an exhibition up now. There are a few museums now that are showing graffiti, not just Haring and Basquiat, but they're understanding more about style writing, the actual letter graffiti, not just the imagery or murals. But I don't have much of a relationship with, and never had with any institution that I can think of.
Okay, thank you, Martha. So Days, then you were part of this first like critical wave of graffiti moving into the gallery, working with legends like Patti Astor of Fun Gallery, Stefan Eins of Fashion Moda. So can you give us into like an inkling into what this kind of period of time was like, and how aware you were of both the kind of potential, but also the potential dangers of the kind of institutional world?
Well, I mean, the first paintings that I made were part of a project that Zephyr and Futura 2000 curated for a guy named Sam Esses. And it was a studio situation. And Sam Esses had provided paint and canvases for people to make their first painting. Well, not maybe not their first, but my first paintings in an environment where I didn't have to really look over my shoulder to see who was coming down the aisle. Um, so I made my first paintings there in the as a part of the Esses project, and I became interested in it. It was something. Wow, okay, this is kind of cool. Maybe somehow, I could evolve in this could evolve into something. And I wasn't really thinking about making a living from it or showing in commercial galleries. But simultaneously, there existed these venues in New York. They were alternative art spaces. And ABC No Rio was one, Fashion Moda was one, Franklin Furnace, Artist Space. And these weren't really commercial galleries that existed for sales. They were more experimental. So I started showing in those places first, and also nightclubs like the Mud Club, or Club 57, which also provided other venues to show art. And this sort of like really exciting largely downtown culture started to emerge. And, you know, I was very much a part of all that. And very slowly, I started to exhibit paintings more and more and be included more and more in group shows and things like that. And yeah, and then eventually commercial galleries started to take notice, but in the beginning, a lot of the galleries had, this sort of commercial outlook on it, like, how can we make money from this, and I felt like a little bit on at ease because they weren't delving into it completely. It was kind of just enough. We can sell some work, and very often commercially it would be successful. They would sell work, but then it would kind of like slow down because they weren't really educating their collectors or the general public about the culture was really about. Um, so um, eventually that kind of trickled off. I want to say by 1985, 86, things started to really slow down in New York as far as the interest from galleries. And I'm lucky that, or we were lucky as a culture that the people in Europe had a different outlook on it that was more about that was more serious and appreciative and looking at it more as like an art form and less of as a curiosity, you know.
Mm.
So I was lucky that that support from the European community was there.
Mm. And then so that took time to then come back to the US again. When did that kind of filter back across the Atlantic?
It started to filter back, I think, sometime in the early 90s, maybe mid 90s, when
Mm.
things started to happen. It never really went away completely either. But um, I think one of the things that was interesting is when Barry McGee started to show at Deitch Gallery and had his first show there. And right around that time, I'm not sure if that was maybe mid 90s or something. Um, I think Barry was talking to Jeffrey and was asking him about us, and Jeffrey was sort of like, "Yeah, I know all these guys, Futura and Zephyr and everybody." And he was like, "What? Invite them to my opening, right away. They've got to be a part of this too." And I think at the same time, a lot of things started to kind of come into play. Again, it was also these magazines became more and more popular, like IGT, which was really the first, but On the Go, and of course 12-ounce Profit, which was my personal introduction to what was happening in Brazil through an article that Caleb had written about it. That article that Caleb wrote with Alan was about the scene in Brazil, and it was somehow it was so interesting to me that I read it and then I reread it a couple of times to get like a full grasp of it. So I thought, wow, okay, I gotta put Brazil on my checklist. Save some money and I'll go down there on a trip and I'll try to connect with some local people and trying to make it happen. And I think I was really interested in it because there seemed to be this sense of freedom down there, and they weren't yet directly influenced by what was happening in New York because the information was so hard to come by in Brazil. Um, and as a matter of fact, as a part of the Hirshhorn exhibition, there's this Xerox copy of subway art that the twins own, and that Xerox copy was passed around to everybody, GAT, because they couldn't access it there.
I'm right. Did Barry give that to them? I think I might have read somewhere, which is just totally nuts.
Well, I think when he first met them, they were painting with these unorthodox materials, like they were largely using rollers and brush paint. The paint that was available there was called Color Gin. Color Gin was largely an auto body paint, so it really wasn't that great. So they were finding new ways to like improvise. And when Barry sort of arrived, he was teaching them how to make mop markers and, you know, talking about fat and showing them different techniques that they were really unaware of. But I was really interested in the way sort of the Brazilian writers kind of interpreted what they had seen in subway art in their own way, and in their own had their own approach to it.
That's incredible. I got to say, I had chills through like most of that answer. That was incredible. But it also kind of leads right on to the question I had for Caleb. So, like Martha, you've been involved with the production of some of like the key graffiti literature, producing books that both showcased and archived the practice. So I'm interested to know how you think about this at the time. So going back to this kind of legendary OSGEMEOS article you first wrote. So at that time, like, could you have even started to believe that, 25 years later, the twins would be having a US museum exhibition? And also, how do you see the relationship between the work the twins were producing then on the street and what you can see in their kind of museum and kind of gallery practice today?
When I first met them, this was December of 1997 when I first met them, and then the article was came out in summer of 98. Um, Raven, Alan Benedict had knew Barry McGee. Barry had gone down there in 93. He had started a connection. They're sending packages and faxes and all that fun stuff back and forth, him and the twins. And then he had connected with Raven. Raven spoke Portuguese, which helped. And so I spoke nothing. Like I knew how to say, like any high school kid, I knew that the couple of swear words that the other high school kid was going to teach you. When you learn, some other language, you learn how to. Not the best way to prep for this first trip. So I was 21 when I went, and I mean I remember the drive from the airport to their house vividly. I mean, it was as if you had taken this whole concept of graffiti, shook it up in a box and turned it up to 25. I mean, it was insane because for one, you had this whole other kind of graffiti, pichação. And this predated This was something that was done with rollers, with paint rollers and latex paint, little tiny paint rollers. And it was sometimes it was these big, tall letters that kind of had a little more in common with 70s album art, the band logos of something like Pink Floyd or Led Zeppelin or whatever. Um, it had a little more of its sort of artistic parentage, although artistic is a real stretch. They weren't trying to be artsy. And they had Sao Paulo, these pichadors, there were so many more of them. And they had Sao Paulo so completely massacred to a degree I had never seen anywhere else in the world. Um, and at 21, honestly, I had traveled quite a lot for someone that age, but it was more painted up in the street than New York maybe ever was. Debatable, or parts of New York, certainly. It was so wrecked as a city that with graffiti that like I couldn't read. Now I had been all over the world. I knew all this different graffiti stuff. When you present me with all this graffiti that I can't read, it took me back to this place where it was scary. And if I'm scared by graffiti, I was like, this is the spot. This is something that is totally different and this is new and I love this. And I'm terrified. And um and in that context, if you had the people like OSGEMEOS and the bunches of other graffiti writers who were doing something artistic and creative, um, kind of following the subway art model, whether they knew about subway art or had seen anything like it or not, it looked colorful and it looked okay. And so there was this sort of permissiveness in Sao Paulo. As long as you had like three colors with you, you were an artist and you were cool. And Sao Paulo is not the prettiest city in the world, and nobody's ever going to really put it up there on that plane. If you've been to Rio and not Sao Paulo, or Rio, yes, you know, Sao Paulo, not at all. Um, it's like comparing San Francisco to Houston or something like that. It's just not fair. No disrespect to Houston. The What was going on in Sao Paulo was that you could take this when hip hop spread all over the world, you had that four elements with your emceeing and your DJing and your graffiti and your breakdancing. And places like in Western Europe where they had all this stuff, you could get yourself some Adidas, a tracksuit, James Brown records, and good spray paint. And they had trains. And you could really kind of one-to-one that as best you could and make something that looked like a really pretty close facsimile of what you saw in subway art. Sao Paulo, that was not happening. One, you try and paint one of their subway trains, you're going to get shot, no questions asked. Um, Two, the Pisha was already there. Like it was already there and going on. And three, the economics were such that so they had to adapt rather than adopt. And they took what they needed and they took what they wanted. And they were like, okay, you know what works? These little rollers that the pichadors use, the pichasau guys use, we're going to fill in our pieces with bucket paints. And then we're going to use these not very good, and very expensive spray paint cans to just outline. And we're going to fill in with those. And those are going to be our tools rather than, um, you know, 20 cans of spray paint. So it was like you just completely reorganized the whole thing. And so trying to put that in words at age 21 was definitely tough. Um, Trying to, and I felt a lot of responsibility for it because I felt like this was something that was, whatever. I'm 48 and I'm talking about something I did when I was 21, that I had a sense that this was an important story to tell. And plus, I had the sense that these, when you ask about could I have seen this happening with the Gemeos, meeting them, I saw, some of the things in the exhibit were these old pieces that I saw in their room those days, those times. And um, to be honest, I don't have a lot of difficulty seeing this. Like it was that clear that these guys were that good that early. And, you know, I'm thankful that they kind of got the support and the recognition that they needed to have that genius, flower.
Mhm. Amazing. Thank you, Keller. That was amazing. So I suppose, yeah, leading on to that also quite directly, I'd like to know more about each of your relationships and collaborations with us, with OSGEMEOS, because I understand all three of you have had a kind of creatively intertwined history with them. So Days, can you tell us about your history with the twins? I understand, like Martha, you have a collaborative piece in the exhibition, but that you were also in Brazil in the early 2000s, and I believe
Right.
worked with them on their first trip to New York. So I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, so I'm, you know, just touching on Caleb's magazine article for a minute. So I read that article. I thought I wanted to go to Brazil. I thought I was going to do it on my own dime. And then soon afterward, Alan Kett called me up and said, he was working for Echo at that point, and they were producing a film on hip hop in Brazil. So he asked me if I wanted to go, and I was like, "What? Bet. When are we leaving?" He was like, "In a few days." So I had to put together my visa and everything, and go there. And I kind of couldn't believe it because this was something that was always on my bucket list, and now it was going. So part of the film, they were filming me, Ogemios, Viche, uh, Jana, Nina. We were all kind of painting a really large wall, and I think that was the first time that I really collaborated with them on a large scale wall, and it was really great. At that point, I was kind of familiar with their work, and it was really easy painting with them and seeing how they worked with each other. Then after that, we started painting more frequently in Sao Paulo. We did productions, and it was always a very organic thing collaborating with them. We didn't, I think Brazilian writers in general, even when many of the people I collaborated with in Rio were also very organic in that there's no plan of like, okay, this is what we're going to do, this is what the theme is going to be about. It's more like you start to like let things happen on their own and build off of each other. And I like that form of collaboration. So it was really easy in that respect to kind of work with them because you're just kind of adapting to the environment and to the situation.
Mm,
Um, yeah.
Great. Thanks, Days. Just before I go on to Martha, I'd like to invite questions from our participants as well. So please, if you have any questions, just write them into the Q&A. But going back to Martha, so likewise, twins extensively, can you tell us a bit more about your relationships with them?
I first met them in Germany, actually, in 2004, when I was on a book tour with my book, Hip Hop Files. And somebody introduced me to them, but I didn't really see their work. They were young, and I didn't pay that much attention, I have to say. Um, and then I was invited to Brazil for a breakdancing event,
Mm.
and spent some more time with them. And they took me around. They showed me some of their walls. I have pictures of that. That was probably in maybe 2008 or 10, I'm not sure. And I would say we became pretty good friends. And now I've been to Brazil a number of times now. Most recently, I think last year, again for a breaking event, but I would never think to go to Sao Paulo and not see them if they're there. And they come and visit me when they're in New York. They were just in New York a couple of weeks ago. And they love looking through all my old photos. So they can spend hours uh, opening drawers of photos, looking on the light box, picking out things. This picture that is supposedly a collaboration, it's mostly them. I mean, this is from a photo that probably was sitting in an outtakes box. They just never get tired of looking at old graffiti, and they can identify everybody. I mean, have encyclopedic knowledge of New York City writers, and they're starting a museum in Brazil. Days, I'm sure you've seen some of that, and
Yes.
they've shown me around, and they're talking about that a lot, and they're collecting things. I mean, they are huge fans as well as practitioners. So,
Incredible. Sounds looking through the photos sounds very
yeah.
dreamy.
Yeah.
Um, and Caleb as well, you were painting with them back in Sao Paulo as well, not just writing about them. That's correct, no?
Yeah, I was painting there. I went, I don't know, about went in 97, went back in 98. Um, After 9/11, I sold my car and went down there for 2001, 2002 for a bunch of months and rented a little place and painted a lot there. I was just in love with the place. I mean, it's Brazil is one of those kind of countries you get this torrid love affair with. Um, and it was definitely, and I knew it was a special time. But back home, it was really, I was trying to focus on telling as many people as I could about, about Brazil and about all the special artists that were there, the way that it was different. And, when, that this was trying to write whatever magazine article, I could find and source, find a spot for. Eventually, was Graffiti Brazil, this book we did, and that was 2005. But, was seeing these things roll, try to push this boulder till it rolls or snowball, whatever it was. That was what was important. But I mean, painting with them was amazing. I loved it. And I was always getting my butt handed to me because they are who they are. Um, and it was wonderful. I treasure those chances to be able to do that. And we got into some ridiculous adventures. Um,
Yeah, sounds amazing. So just finally, before we go to the Q&A, or then I'm still encouraging more questions to come in. There's this kind of final aspect of the program, thinking about how graffiti imagery has permeated our culture, has evolved over time. And this is a question for all of you. I mean, in London, where I am, there's still a very negative appreciation of graffiti. It's still really hard to kind of push this more kind of complex understanding of the art form and the subculture. And I wonder if you think exhibitions like that's taking place at the Hirshhorn, and just kind of the wider change in the understanding of graffiti, I wonder if you think there has been a change locally where you are in terms of how the institutional framework enabled a kind of better understanding of what graffiti actually is. So any of you can kind of jump in on this.
Well, I think in London a few years ago, you know, pretty recently, there was the Beyond the Streets exhibition that Roger Gassman put together. And it was amazing in many, many ways. For one thing, a lot of people from New York came over for it, and a lot of people that came over for it hadn't seen each other since before COVID. So it was a bit of a reunion in London. But I always have a great time there and a great time, meeting writers there. But something like that hadn't happened maybe ever, you know. And I think that there was record attendance levels at the Saatchi Museum. The exhibition took over the whole Saatchi Museum, and you know it was just record attendance levels every weekend, or people that were coming to see it, how they could get tickets, and blah blah blah. So I mean, possibly it's changing a bit in the UK, their institutional perception of it, and maybe it might open up more of a dialogue there, but it still kind of remains to be seen, but I know that a lot of people were interested in that exhibition.
And in the US, do you think, in the context that has made a change?
Yeah, I think it has a bit. I think institutions in the United States, they collect it, not in mass. They're not running out to collect people from this culture, but they are collecting it, and there are um, exhibitions in museums, but it's still really difficult. It's
Mm.
not a given. And
Mm.
it's not a given because of the politics behind it and the people that fund these exhibitions, whether they're companies or private individuals and whoever it is that they're linked with, that still doesn't really like it or understand it. So it's happening a lot more than it did, say, in the 80s or 90s, but it's still a long way to go.
Caleb, Martha?
Well, agreed. You're not seeing MoMA advertising a graffiti exhibit anytime soon.
No.
And as far as I know, I haven't heard, I know, of course, they have Basquiat and Haring. Do they have any letter graffiti in their collection at the Museum of Modern Art in New York? Are they even looking at it? Are they even
Um,
thinking that this might be
I mean,
contemporary art?
they do have, for example, like Remo Z. They've got little things,
Yeah, but I mean, they're not, are
not
they really,
major.
they're a contemporary art museum. Could there be anything more contemporary than this? You would
Right.
think that there might be more interest because there's some, no matter, I'm in Italy right now. I'm in Verona. I'm not in Milan or Florence. I'm out in the country and there are graffiti walls everywhere and they're good ones. They're innovative, they're unusual. It's taken hold in a way that what else has? And I honestly don't think curators understand that in contemporary art museums.
True. It's a language that they don't speak. They may
Right.
know a couple of words, but they're not fluent, and they're far from
Exactly.
being fluent.
Very well said.
Mhm.
Caleb?
Yeah, well, I don't know that unanimity is ever something you get in art. I think generally, and there's going to be some of these great big aircraft carrier sized museums that are going to take a long time to turn. And I think that's pretty well a constant. I mean, there's some of them are a little more nimble and some of them get on it. And then the other ones end up 50 years down the line looking for collectors who are going to donate and looking for, what they can find. But I think, graffiti always has this present day, present tense
Hmm.
requirement that it be a way to give a great big middle finger for the people who are out there doing it and having zero problem being hated. I think that's a really, if graffiti ever loses that ability to be hated, or that core aspect from the people who are out there doing big illegal graffiti, it, it it becomes a shame. Um, but they're different creatures. The stuff inside and the stuff outside. And, the stuff that gets inside always has to answer to the 17-year-old who just did something that everybody really doesn't like and isn't very good in a place where everybody can see it, not far off. And I think there's a nice tension there.
That's great. So just looking at the chat now, the first one I've just seen is where can we find Caleb's article on graffiti in Brazil, which is a great question. Where does that article exist?
That's good luck. Um, it's not, I mean, it was something that came and went, but a lot of what you can find if you want to find a copy of Graffiti Brazil, which is a Thames and Hudson book, you can find one of those a lot more easily on, where you get books or eBay or whatever. But the 12-ounce article doesn't come up on eBay very often. If it does, it's going to cost you. Um, Maybe one day it'll resurface somehow. I don't know.
A scan somewhere. There'll be a scan somewhere. There's a great question that came in. Are there any conflicts as graffiti artists feel when considering joining the contemporary art world? Does it feel like a contradiction? How does one manage these feelings? I suppose that's a good one for Days.
Well, I think it all goes back to how you feel about it and what you feel comfortable doing. There was really in the early 80s, there was a period where I was still painting trains and at the same time have been included in my first group shows. And it was really hard to kind of manage to be in both of those worlds simultaneously. But very slowly, I saw myself kind of evolving into another direction. And at the same time, there was another generation kind of coming up right behind me. And I felt like it was their turn to shine and their turn to get attention. So I just sort of slowly segued out of it, but not completely because I still paint quite often every single year, and I've never stopped. So it just changed into something different for me.
Mhm. I suppose that kind of links to another question. Do you all think the success of artists like OSGEMEOS has broken down the wall between fine art and street art, or what they'd called graffiti? Or do you feel the fine art world is still resistant to incorporating it? Is resistant to incorporating it? Caleb or Martha?
I think
Maybe.
people, sorry, Martha, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that, thank you to the Hirshhorn for the wonderful show. But I do think that it was their murals and their imagery
Mm.
that captivated the curators, and probably not their letter graffiti. That that's probably like an afterthought. It's more about their characters that got them into the Hirshhorn. It's my opinion.
Caleb?
I mean, somebody like the people like the twins are so good. They break down barriers just being who they are and doing their work. That's it. They showed up, they showed up in Boston back, I don't know, for a smaller museum show at the ICA in 2012. And they did a big mural that is still the best mural that's been done in Boston. Sorry to all my friends and me who tried, afterwards. But like suddenly after that starts murals in Boston. They have a way of, they have a way of leaving a wake that other people can fish in.
So Marina says, thank you for the incredible discussion. Where do you think the most exciting graffiti is being created now? And what should we be looking at? So anyone, please feel step in. Martha, you've talked about
I mean, I would just say wherever you are, keep your eyes open. For me, one of the great things about graffiti is that it's here one day, and you can pass by the same place the next day and it could be gone over. I mean, it really keeps me alert when walking around the city. It's a great treasure hunt. So just it's everywhere.
I always think it's interesting to see, like, pieces in some country where, you wouldn't really expect it, like maybe some part of Thailand or other parts of South America, or just someplace, where we think, wow, has the culture really gone that far? And and yet it has, because somebody got a little piece of the information and then they're out there painting. Somebody, it lit the fuse, and then all of a sudden there's somebody out there, painting a wall or a train or something. So I mean, it's hard to say if there's any one city, because now it's so dispersed, you know.
Caleb?
Well, I agree. I mean, everything is so, information spreads so quickly now, and anything good is going to bounce around Instagram and everything else so quickly now. But um, when I get to see work by somebody who is taking, especially a language that's doesn't happen to use our alphabet
Mm.
and works in that way, and does it in a new spin. Um, whether it's somewhere in, India, Nepal, whether it's, in places where it's politically charged, maybe a little more politically charged than we would know how to wrap our heads around. What does graffiti mean in China? What does graffiti mean in Iran? What does graffiti mean um, in the Middle East and so forth? Like what does it mean in these places, and how are people creating the meaning out of that, taking this framework, this artwork of freedom, which is nothing else, this American art form that signals freedom somehow, um, in places that are not free. How do they make artwork that really sings in those places?
Thanks, Caleb. It was actually also making me think about when you were talking about the twins before in Brazil, and the way that it was so different from the kind of what you call like the one-on-one kind of Western European experience. I think, for me, a lot of the work that came out of Ukraine and Poland and places that were kind of under kind of or behind the Iron Curtain in a similar way took what they could, the kind of inklings of what was happening in New York, and pairing that up with other kind of influences to create something which was totally new in a kind of similar way to what could happen in Brazil. So I suppose that leads to a question we had from Yasna. which is about what about other writers or crews in South America or Latin America?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they're out there, I mean, in Rio, I painted a lot with a group called the Flashback Crew. Um, but now those guys are considered old school there, like they've inspired, a whole other generation. But places like Ecuador and Argentina, there's people painting
Colombia.
there. Colombia. Yeah, I went on this trip. I went to Ecuador in the early 80s, and there was really no scene there that was happening, and painted there a bit, and then came back in, I don't know, I think it was around 2014 or around that time, or maybe 2011. And there was a whole scene there. They even had a Montana paint store there in Quito, and there was all this development in the meantime. And it was kind of amazing to see that happen.
Hmm. Caleb, Martha?
Well, I had a large, speaking of institutions, I didn't mention, one of my biggest exhibitions was in the Museum of Contemporary Art in Peru,
Hmm.
in Lima. And it was a really good exhibition. And the writers there took me to a kind of secret area where they were just making pieces for each other. And there were amazing pieces that only they knew about. And I found that especially fascinating. I mean, we know that you can't really sell a piece, but the idea that you're not doing it for like every train rider, but you're only doing it for sort of experts in your culture to be able to see these amazing pieces. I kind of wish that the curators in Peru would have gone there. It was amazing.
Hmm.
Cool.
But I've also been to, I did Two Fly is Ecuadorian, and she organized an entire female uh, festival in Ecuador. So
Wow.
there's a lot happening in South
Wow.
America.
Okay, we've got some other great questions, but I think they're going to be too long to answer. I might try and kind of type in a few answers after we finish, but we've just got about 2 minutes left. So I just want to really thank Days, Martha and Caleb, for their like really incredible discussions and conversation. Really was so rich. So thank you so much. Thank everyone whose questions we were able to answer. Everyone at the Hirshhorn. Thank you to our interpreters, Gordon and Kathy, to Amy Barr, the head of public program for the Hirshhorn, for myself as well, Raphael Schachter. Thank you. And have a great day. Thank you very much for all being involved.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Thank you all.
All right.